Siege and Storm, Chapter 4. Rosalie was a folk story, a fairy tale, a creature of dreams that lived on the edges of maps. But there could be no doubt. The ice dragon was real, and Mal had found it, just as he had found the staff. It felt wrong, like everything was happening too quickly, as if we were rushing towards something we didn't understand. A shout from the longboats drew my attention. A man on the boat nearest the ship whip stood up, a harpoon in his hand, taking aim. But the dragon's white tail lashed through the sea, split the waves, and came down with a slap, sending a rolling wall of water up against the boat's hull. The man with the harpoon sat down hard as the longboat tipped perilously, then righted itself at the last moment. Good, I thought. Fight them. Then the other boat let fly their harpoons. The first went wide and splashed harmlessly in the water. The second lodged in the sea whip's hide. It bucked, tail whipping back and forth, then reared up like a snake, hurling its body out of the water. For a moment it hung suspended in the air, translucent, wing-like fins, gleaming scales, and wrathful red eyes. Beads of water flew from its mane, and its massive jaws opened, revealing a pink tongue and rows of gleaming teeth. It came down on the nearest boat with a loud crash of splintering wood. The slender craft split in two, and men poured into the sea. The dragon's mouth snapped closed over sailor's leg, and he vanished, screaming beneath the waves. With furious strokes, the rest of the crewmen swam through the blood-stained water, making for the remaining longboat where they were hauled over the side. I glanced back up to the whaler's rigging. The tops of the masts were shrouded in mist now. I could still make out the light of Tamar's lantern burning steadily atop the main royal. Another harpoon found its target, and the sea whip began to sing, a sound more lovely than anything I'd ever heard. A choir of voices lifted in plaintive, wordless song. No, I realized, not a song. The sea whip was crying it out, whipping and rolling in the waves as the longboats gave chase, struggling to shake in the hooked tips of the harpoons free. Fight, I pleaded silently. Once he has you, he'll never let you go. But I could already see the dragon slowing, its movements growing sluggish as its cries wavered. Mournful now, the music bleak and fading. Part of me wished the Darkling would just end it. Why didn't he? Why not use the cut on the sea whip and bind me to him as he had done with the stag? Nets! Shouted Stormhound, but the mist had grown so thick that I couldn't quite tell where his voice was coming from. I heard a series of tongues from somewhere near the starboard rail. Clear the mist, ordered the Darkling. We're losing this longboat. I heard the Grisha calling to one another, and then felt the billow of squall wind tugging at the hem of my coat. The mist lifted and my jaw dropped. The Darkling and his Grisha still stood on the starboard side, attention focused on the longboat that now seemed to be rowing away from the whaler. But on the port side another ship had appeared as if from nowhere, a sleek schooner with gleaming masts and colors flying, a red dog on a teal field, and below it, in blue and gold, Rafkin double eagles. I heard another cry of tongues and saw steel clouds studding the whaler's port side rail, grappling hooks, I realized. And then everything seemed to happen at once. A howl went up from somewhere like a wolf baying at the moon. Men swarmed over the rail into the whaler's desks, pistols strapped to their chests, cutlasses in their hands, yowling and barking like a pack of wild dogs. I saw the Darkling turn, confusion and rage on his face. What the hell is going on? Mal said, stepping in front of me as we edged toward the meager protection of the mizzen mast. I don't know, I replied. Something very good, or something very, very bad. We stood back to back, my hands still trapped in irons, his still bound, powerless to defend ourselves as the deck erupted into fighting. Pistol shots rang out. The air came alive with infernal fire. To me, hounds! The Stormhound shouted, and plunged into the action, a saber in his hand. Barking, yipping, snarling men were descending on the Darkling's Grisha from all sides. Not just from the railing of the schooner, but from the rigging of the water as well. Stormhound was turning against the Darkling. The privateer had clearly lost his mind. Yes, the Grisha were outnumbered, but numbers didn't matter in a fight with the Darkling. "Look!" Mal shouted. Down in the water, the men in the screaming longboat had the struggling sea whip in tow. They had raised a sail, and a brisk wind was driving them, not toward the whaler, but directly toward the schooner instead. The stiff breeze that carried them seemed to come from nowhere. I looked closer. A crewman was standing in the longboat, arms raised. There was no mistaking him. Stormhound had a squaller working for him. Suddenly, an arm seized me around the waist, and I was lifted off my feet. The world seemed to upend itself, and I shrieked as I was thrown over a huge shoulder. I lifted my head, struggling against the arm that held me like a steel band, and saw Tama rushing toward Mal, a knife gleaming in her hands. "No!" I screamed. "Mal!" He put his hands to defend himself, but all she did was slice through his bones. "Go!" she shouted, tossing him the knife and drawing a sword from the scabbard at her hip. Tolia clutched me tight as he sprinted over the deck. Tama and Mal were closer behind. "What are you doing?" I squawked, my head jouncing against the giant's back. "Just run," Tama replied, slashing at a Kobraki who threw himself into her path. "I can't run," I shouted back. "Your idiot brother has me slung over his shoulder like a ham. Do you want to be rescued or not?" I didn't have time to answer. "Hold tight," Tolia said. "We're going over." I squeezed my eyes shut, preparing to tumble into the icy water, but Tolia hadn't gone more than a few steps when he gave a sudden grunt and fell to one knee, losing his grip on me. I toppled onto the deck and rolled clumsily to my side. When I looked up, I saw Ivan and a blue-robed Inferni standing over us. Ivan's hand was outstretched. He was crushing Tolia's heart, and this time, Stormhound wasn't there to stop him. The Inferni advanced on Tama and Mal, flint in hand, arm already moving in an arc of flame. Over before it began, I thought miserably, but in the next moment the Inferni stopped and gasped. His flames died in the air. "What are you waiting for?" The Inferni's only response was a choked hiss. His eyes bulged. He clawed at his throat. Tama held his sword in her right hand, but her left fist was clenched. "Good trick," she said, swatting away the paralyzed Inferni's flint. "I know a good trick too." She raised her blade, and as the Inferni stood helpless, desperate for air, she ran him through with one vicious thrust. The Inferni crumpled to the deck. Ivan stared in confusion at Tama standing over the lifeless body, her sword dripping blood. His concentration must have wavered, because in that moment Tolia came up from his knee with a terrifying roar. Ivan clutched his fist, refocusing his efforts. Tolia grimaced, but he did not fall. Then the giant's hand shot out, and Ivan's face spasmed in pain and bewilderment. I looked from Tolia to Tama, realization dawning. They were Grisha, Heartrenders. "Do you like that little man?" Tolia asked as he stalked toward Ivan. Desperately, Ivan cast out another hand. He was shaken, and I could see he was struggling for breath. Tolia bobbled slightly, but kept coming. "Now we learn who has the stronger heart," he growled. He strode slowly forward like he was walking against a hard wind, his face beaded with sweat, his teeth bared in feral gray. I wondered if he and Ivan would just fall down dead. Then the fingers of Tolia's outstretched hands curled into a fist. Ivan convulsed. His eyes rolled up in his head. A bubble of blood blossomed and burst on his lips. He collapsed under the desk. Dimly, I was aware of the chaos raging around me. Tamar was struggling with the squaller. Two other Grisha had leapt on Titania. I heard a gunshot and realized Mal had gotten hold of a pistol. But all I could see was Ivan's lifeless body. He was dead, the Darkling's right hand, one of the most powerful Heartrenders in the Second Army. He'd survived the Fold and the Volcra, and now he was dead. A tiny sob drew me out of my reverie. Genya stood, gazing down at Ivan, her hands over her mouth. "Genya," I said. "Stop them!" The shout came from across the deck. I turned and saw the Darkling grappling with an armed sailor. Genya was shaking. She reached into the pocket of a kefta and drew a pistol. Tolia lunged toward her. "No," I said, stepping between them. I wasn't going to watch him kill Genya. The heavy pistol trembled in her hand. "Genya," I said quietly, "are you really going to shoot me?" She looked around widely, unsure of where to aim. I laid a hand on her sleeve. She flinched and turned the barrel on me. A crack like thunder rent the air, and I knew the Darkling had gotten free. I looked back and saw a wave of darkness tumbling toward us. It's over, I thought. We're done for. But in the next instant, I glimpsed a bright flash and a shot rang out. The swell of darkness blew away into nothing, and I saw the Darkling clutching his arm, his face contorted in fury and pain. In disbelief, I realized he'd been shot. Sturmhound was racing toward us, pistols in hand. "Run!" he shouted. "Come on, Alina," Mal cried, reaching for my arm. "Jenny," I said desperately, "come with us." Her hand was shaking so badly. I thought the pistol might fly from her grip. Tears spilled over her cheeks. "I can't," she sobbed brokenly. She lowered her weapon. "Go, Alina," she said. "Just go." In the next instant, Tolia had tossed me over his shoulder. Again, I beat futilely at his broad back. "No," I yelled. "Wait." But no one paid me any mind. Tolia took a running leap and vaulted over the railing. I screamed as we plummeted toward the icy water, bracing for the impact. Instead, we were scooped up by what I could only have been a squall of wind, and deposited on the attacking schooner's deck with a bone-jarring thud. Tamar and Mal followed, with Sturmhound close behind. "Give the signal," Sturmhound shouted, springing to his feet. A piercing whistle blew. "Triviat," he called to a crewman I didn't recognize. "How many do we have?" "8 men down," replied Triviat. 4 remaining on the whaler. Cargo on its way up." "Saints!" Sturmhound swore. He looked down to the whaler, struggling with himself. "Musketeers!" he shouted to the men on the schooner's maintop. "Lend them cover!" The musketeers began firing their rifles down onto the deck of the whaler. Tolia tossed Mal a rifle, then slung another over his back. He leapt into the rigging and began to climb. Tamar drew a pistol from her hip. I was still sprawled on the deck in an undignified tangle, my hands held useless in irons. Sea whip is secured, Captain," shouted Privet. 2 more of Sturmhound's men hurtled over the whaler's railing and flew through the air, arms pinwheeling widely, to crash in a heap on the schooner's deck. One was bleeding badly from a wound on its arm. Then it came again, the boom of thunder. "He's up!" called Tamar. Blackness tumbled toward up, engulfing the schooner, blotting out everything in its path. "Free me," I pleaded. "Let me help." Sturmhound threw Tamar the keys and shouted, "Do it!" Tamar reached for my wrists, fumbling with the key as darkness rolled over us. We were blind. I heard someone scream. Then the lock clicked free. The irons fell from my wrists and hit the deck with a dull ring. I raised my hands, and light blazed through the dark, pushing the darkness back over the whaler. A cheer went up from the Sturmhound's crew, but it writhed on the lips as another sound filled the air, a grating shriek, piercing in its wrongness, the creak of a door swinging open, a door that should have remained forever shut. The wound on my shoulder gave a sharp throb. "Nikyoya!" I turned to Sturmhound. "We have to get out of here," I said. "Now!" He hesitated, battling himself. 2 of his men were still aboard the whaler. His expression hardened. "Topmen, make sail," he shouted. "Squallers, due cast." I saw a row of sailors standing by the masts raise their arms and heard a wimp as the canvas above us swelled with a hard-driving wind. Just how many Grisha did the privateer have in his crew? But the darkling squallers had arranged themselves on the whaler's deck and were sending their own winds to buffet us. The schooner rocked unsteadily. "Port side guns," roared Sturmhound, rolling broadside on my signal. I heard 2 shrill whistle blasts. A deafening boom shook the ship, then another and another, as the schooner's guns opened up a gaping hole in the whaler's hull. A panicked shout went up from the Darkling's ship. Sturmhound's squallers seized the advantage, and the schooner surged free. As the smoke from the cannons cleared, I saw a figure in black step up to the railing of the disabled whaler. Another wave of darkness rushed toward us, but this one was different. It rid of the water as if it were clawing its way forward, and with it came the eerie clinking of 1,000 angry insects. Darkness frothed and foamed like a wave breaking over a boulder, and began to separate itself into shapes. Beside me, Mal muttered a prayer and lifted his rifle to his shoulder. I focused my power and slashed out with the cut, burning through the black cloud, trying to destroy the Nekvoya before they could take their full form. But I couldn't stop them all. They came on in a moaning horde of black teeth and clouds. Stormhound's crew open-fired. The Nekvoya reached the masts of the schooner, whirling around the sails, plucking sailors from the rigging like fruit. Then they were skittering down on the deck. Mal fired again and again as the crewmen drew their sabers, but bullets and blades seemed only to slow the monsters. Their shadow bodies wavered and reformed, and they just kept coming. The schooner was still moving ahead, widening the distance between itself and the whaler. Not fast enough. I heard that shrieking moan, and another wave of shifting, slithering darkness was headed toward us, already separating into winged bodies, reinforcements for the shadow soldiers. Stormhound saw it too. He pointed to one of the squallers, still summoning winds to the sails. "Lightning!" he shouted. I flinched. He couldn't mean it. Squallers were never permitted to draw lightning. It was too unpredictable, too dangerous, and on open seas, with wooden ships. But Stormhound's Gracia didn't hesitate. The squallers clapped their hands together, rubbing their palms back and forth. My ears popped as the pressure plummeted. The air cackled with current. We had just enough time to hurl ourselves to the deck as jagged bolts of lightning zigzagged across the sky. The new wave of Nekwoza scattered in momentary confusion. "Go!" Stormhound bellowed. "Squallers at full!" Mal and I were thrown against the railing as the schooner shot forward. The sleek ship seemed to fly over the waves. I saw another black swell billow out from the side of the whaler. I lurched to my feet, bracing myself, gathering my strength for another assault. But it did not come. It seemed there was a limit to the Darkling's power. We edged out of his range. I leaned over the railing. The wind and sea spray stung my skin as the Darkling's ship and his monsters disappeared from the view. Something between a laugh and a sob ragged my chest. Mal threw his arms around me, and I held tight, feeling the wet press of his shirt against my cheek, listening to the pounding of his heart, clinging to the unbelievable truth that we were still alive. Then, despite the blood they'd shed and the friends they'd lost, the schooner's crew broke into cheers. They whooped and hollered and barked and growled. In the rigging, Tolia lifted his rifle and with one hand and threw his head back, releasing a howl of triumph that lifted the hair on my arms. Mal and I drew apart, gazing at the crewmen yipping and laughing around us. I knew we were both thinking the same thing. Just what had we gotten ourselves into?